Welcome, everyone, to the ICSS Sunday Morning Marxist Forum. My name is Alan Miller, and I'm a member of the Program Committee for ICSS Sunday Morning Sessions. We're based in Oakland, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area, USA. Our weekly programs are online via Zoom every Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m. Pacific Time. You can sign up at our website, icssmarks.org, to receive weekly email announcements for our Sunday sessions. We started doing this program in Oakland in 2006, and you can view videos of past presentations, send us a message using our contact form, and make a donation to support our programs on our website at icssmarks.org. We're pleased today to have as our speaker British journalist Kit Klarenberg, who writes for the Grey Zone and Mint Press News. Kit is also the co-host of Decline and Fall, an excellent weekly radio stream on YouTube and Rumble, co-hosted with Alexander McKay. For those of you who are not familiar with Kit's work, he is one of the finest anti-imperialist journalists working today. For his efforts, the British government has rewarded him by basically forcing him into exile, where rather than backing down, Kit regularly publishes outstanding pieces on the criminal modus operandi of Anglo-American imperialism. Kit's Substack is at substack.com, Kit Klarenberg, at Kit Klarenberg, and Decline and Fall is at dandf.substack.com. If somebody could drop those into the chat window, that would be great. Kit will be speaking to us today about the recent developments in Nepal. So welcome, Kit, to Sunday Morning Marxist Forum. We're really happy to have you here.
Likewise, thank you for that extremely kind introduction. It's more than I'm used to and more than I deserve, I think. But yeah, no, very happy to be appearing today. Thank you.
All right, you can go ahead and get started.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, the topic of today is recent developments in Nepal. For viewers and listeners who haven't been paying attention, there's been a lot going on recently. You are forgiven. At the very start of September, mass riots kicked off in Kathmandu, which is the capital of Nepal, and very quickly they led to public and private buildings being set on fire, the residences of government ministers, including the Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli, they were set ablaze. Officials were ferried to safety via helicopter. On September 9th, Sharma Oli resigned. And then within a matter of days, a interim leader was chosen via the rather unusual expedient of an online vote via Discord, which is this kind of online chat app, which is primarily used by gamers, as far as I'm aware. Now, after an initial burst of media interest, this has kind of fallen by the wayside, and I think that it's actually it's important to keep an eye on this because I think it demonstrates that for all of the talk of the US empire, like kind of retrenching and refocusing its efforts on domestic repression and knocking Latin America, America's backyard, so to speak, into line. It shows that the Asia Pacific region remains of intense interest geopolitically to Washington. And I also think as well that the developments that have occurred since the media stopped paying attention really speak to the fact that this was a color revolution. That's not merely just in the form of the people who've been appointed to this interim government in Nepal, but there have been a series of leaks. I await my investigation for the Grey Zone on this being published. I wish it was out now, but sadly it isn't for a variety of reasons. Yeah, there's been a series of leaked documents which show that for years leading up to this supposedly spontaneous explosion of dissent dissent by Gen Zers in Nepal. A wing of the National Endowment for Democracy, which is an avowed CIA front, called the International Republican Institute, which is linked to the Republican Party in the US, they were explicitly funding to the tune of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, a variety of efforts to create a nexus locally in Nepal of chaos agents, specifically teaching them in protest, in demonstration, other forms of political action, in order to foment unrest around issues of concern to Washington. And throughout these leaked files, repeated references made to the significance of Nepal from the from the perspective of Washington's Asia Pacific strategy. Now, Nepal, for people who are unaware of the geography, it is a kind of forbidding earthquake-prone mountainous region sandwiched between China and India. Now, given that China remains kind of public enemy number one from the US empire's perspective, and India has shifted, I think the phrase that Trump used was India has been lost to China and Russia. Obviously, within this wider geopolitical context, creating a source of agitation and creating a pliable puppet state in Nepal could not be more urgent, right? There is a long-running, wide-ranging effort to encircle China with pliable puppet governments that that ask how high whenever they're asked to jump, and are welcoming of US military installations. And I might add that my colleague and I, my colleague Wyatt Reed and I, last year, we reported on leaked files which showed that IRI, the International Republican Institute, was engaged in almost identical efforts in Bangladesh to train youth activists to rise up against the government, and that resulted in a coup. So we've seen again a coup play out in Nepal. Now, like I said, this initially elicited this flurry of media attention, and there was a lot of focus on the fact that Nepalese youth are disaffected and disillusioned, and they wanted change, and they wanted something different. I'm sure that's true to an extent, because US color revolutions always try and exploit and harness legitimate grievances in order to stir insurrectionary fervor amongst the population. But invariably, what replaces these ousted governments is our administrations that are far worse. And we've seen this happen the world over for the past 25 years. Something that really perked my suspicion initially was the fact that there is this hitherto unknown NGO called Hami Nepal, which was set up in 2015 to provide food, medical, and other aid to disadvantaged local communities. They have no history of political activism at all, and yet they are at the forefront of this. They organize the protests. They set up a dedicated demonstration support hotline in the days leading up to the protest that ousted the elected government. They have played an outsized role in media coverage of this, and they also were the kind of guardians or gatekeepers of the installation of the interim government, which was, yes, as I say, elected on September 12th via Discord. This is a chat group that has 145,000 members, and Nepal is a country of 30 million people, so it's not particularly democratic. But once the government fell, that the media seemed to lose all interest in happenings in Nepal. Since then, the interim government has not only been filled with individuals who have extensive backgrounds with Western foundations that are usually intelligence cutouts, the World Economic Forum, but also Nepal's military, which is a very powerful force within Nepalese society. They have been, in the words of Victoria Newland, kind of midwifing this thing, and they have been really pushing figures who call for the restoration of Nepal's absolute monarchy. Which should raise eyebrows and suspicions about what's really going on here. Now, Hami Nepal, if you go to their website, they openly list brands that support us, which is quite strange for a supposedly grassroots revolutionary movement to be sponsored by Western corporations and like Coca-Cola and the Israeli-created messaging app Viber. But Hami Nepal openly advertise this on their website. They also note that they receive support of an indeterminate nature, it must be stated, from Students for a Free Tibet, which is funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. Yes, again, an avowed CIA front. So yeah, like this should raise very obvious questions about the actual forces behind this revolutionary upheaval in Nepal, and who or whose interests are ultimately being served by a change of government there. Now, I mentioned subsequent leaks. There have been a flurry of disclosures of sensitive documents, which show, as I say, that the NED was involved in training vast armies of youth activists to take to the streets and cause havoc if their government didn't act as required according to US policy objectives, which just lends further weight to the notion that this wasn't a spontaneous grassroots upsurge of dissent, but was actually something far darker.
Go ahead. You can just hit whatever points you want. We will
Oh
do
yeah, sure.
Q&A later.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I mean, the documents themselves, I forwarded you some of them. They talk about creating a emerging leader program, which is concerned with identifying and grooming people who will be civil society leaders, who will be politically influential, encouraging them to create political parties, encouraging them to run for office. And this has been ongoing for a number of years before the overthrow of the government in September. You don't need to be a conspiracy theorist or particularly paranoid to conclude that what happened in Nepal was a direct product of these programs. And they openly talk about how we need to build momentum for youth activism and put pressure on Nepali political decision makers so they're more responsive to the concerns of the population. But the same files make clear that what NED categorizes as the concerns of the population are, quote unquote, democratic reforms advocated by the US. The explicit purpose is to ensure that Nepal develops according to a well-honed script drawn up in Washington, rather than having anything to do with the entirely legitimate concerns about corruption, lack of employment opportunities, and other very common issues that blight countries in the global South by design. there are also very candid references to ensuring that Nepalese youth leaders trained under these programs endorse and advocate US values, quote unquote, and can then be mobilized to launch advocacy campaigns on issues of US concern. So again, this has absolutely nothing to do with people power or public will or wishes. It's about creating a perfect client state which will do the US bidding as and when required. And I think that as I say, there was quite some controversy when all this erupted. There were certain geopolitical analysts who were very quick to say, well, people do have young Nepalese citizens do have legitimate concerns, and this is the trigger for their for the upheaval. Now, again, this might be true, but this is the exact same script we've seen over and over and over again play out across the world. For a time, the US was entirely overt in advertising the fact that they sponsored stuff like this. So in 2005, USAID, the now defunct, or is it, intelligence front run by Washington, it published a very glossy magazine called Democracy Rising, which offered very detailed accounts of how the US stirred anti-government insurrection in Yugoslavia, Lebanon, Ukraine, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, other countries in the former kind of Soviet sphere or the former Yugoslavia in the early 2000s. It's that publication is rife with very illuminating quotes from participants where they say, well, we couldn't have done this without foreign help. Now, that and you can find mainstream media reports from the time that kind of openly promote the US's central role in doing this. You fast forward to today, and that acknowledgement and admission is entirely lacking. My surmise is because there are ongoing crackdowns on NED's operations in enemy states like China and Russia and Iran, where NED is banned. It's kind of become unsayable that the NED and its various grantees are concerned with regime change, as it was openly admitted before, because now it's villains like Putin and Xi and others who are saying this. So I mean, in a quite striking example of this paradigm shift, The Guardian in 2004, it published a very detailed investigation into how that year's Orange Revolution in Ukraine was whipped up by the US. It was the product of US marketing and propaganda strategies, and it occurred according to a well-honed script, which has been deployed over and over again to reverse the results of other countries' elections. And then you fast forward to 2015 when Russia banned NED, and The Guardian relied on a quote drawn from NED's own website to describe its operations. And then you have the Maidan coup, which is and this is something I've written about for my website, was unambiguously a NED operation. Every individual and group at the Maidan's forefront was in receipt of NED or USAID funding. Many of the people leading these NGOs in the lead up to Maidan explicitly stated that their objective was to overthrow the government. In late 2013, you have then president of NED, Carl Gershman, write an op-ed for the Washington Post in which he talks about how all of the sterling work his organization is doing to reduce Russia's influence in its near abroad, the cluster of countries that once comprised the Soviet Union. And it talks about how Gershman talked about how Ukraine was the grand prize in terms of overthrowing the elected administration and installing a pliable government in its place. But the very clear foreign role in Maidan has been systematically denied, obscured, dismissed as Russian disinformation or conspiracy theory or worse. So yeah, there's quite an interesting shift on this, and very obvious questions aren't being asked by mainstream journalists. They are by independent journalists, although their influence relative to the New York Times and the Washington Post is kind of minimal. Yeah, what we have now is effectively in Nepal a government, an interim government, although it's not clear whether they will actually hold elections in 6 months as they have promised to do. An interim government which has very questionable public support and legitimacy. The military attempting to push this new administration in a pro-monarchist direction. Nepal was ruled until I think it was 1990 by an absolute monarchy, which was deeply repressive, and there was zero civil society, there was zero dissent tolerated. I mean, it's the fact that this has just kind of happened without anyone really noticing is actually really quite shocking. And another thing to bear in mind about this as well is a key ignition point, it seems, for the revolution in Nepal was the Nepalese government's attempt to emulate China's internet sovereignty, which is to say, creating its own social media and e-commerce structures and blocking certain foreign sites, which has led to in China the birth of homegrown internet platforms and resources which are very popular, and the lessening of relevance of Western social media platforms like Facebook and WhatsApp and this kind of assorted soup of resources which are basically just spying tools, which in effect serve as wings of the US government. Now, Nepal was really pushing, the now fallen Nepalese government was really pushing for its own internet, so to speak, and with its own kind of firewall blocking noxious influence from abroad. In early September, the Nepalese government required foreign online platforms to register with the government to make them more legally accountable and ensure that taxes could be collected on revenues they generate globally, which is a very serious problem that even countries in Western Europe really struggle to get Facebook and Snapchat and all these other platforms to actually pay money for the vast revenue they generate locally, and they try and claim, well, we're not a local company, we're based in the US, so it's nothing to do with us, sorry. And then that once this registration requirement was implemented, most foreign social media platforms refused to sign up for it, leading to their ban. Now, this was the spark that ultimately toppled Nepal's government, and a large number of NED and Open Society foundations, that's George Soros's regime change arm, a large number of organizations funded by these entities started making a stink about this. They claimed that it was a savage crackdown on freedom of expression and access to the internet, etc. For Hami Nepal, it was avowedly a tipping point, which led to them scheduling a mass rally, which is what ultimately dislodged the Nepalese government. And it must be added as well that these protests at the start of September, they quickly turned extremely violent, and groups like Hami Nepal were very quick to distance themselves from the fiery tumult. And then yet their Discord server was bristling with belligerent, if not outright murderous messages in the preceding days, with like some users openly talking about killing politicians and their children, and claiming that they wanted access to machine guns, and stated they were going to burn everything, which they actually did. I mean, that kind of repudiation, it doesn't really wash. Like, this was always going to be a kind of violent showdown. And the fact that the military has effectively signed off on this should also give us pause, because I mentioned in Bangladesh, last year, we saw a similar dynamic play out, where you had all of these student groups and youth activist movements who were the public face of the government's overthrow, and yet it was the military that was fundamental to the government's removal, and in the lead up to this coup, the head of Bangladesh's government, a woman called Sheikh Hasina, claimed that she'd been under intensive pressure to allow for the construction of a US military base in Bangladesh, and that she had rejected this, which, I mean, seems like a fairly obvious trigger for why this unrest happened. And I think it's the same in Nepal. The geopolitical circumstances are such that the US is very, very, very keen to create sources of agitation, distraction, and unrest on China's borders, because it can't fight a direct war with Beijing. So it relies on proxies. Now, of course, Nepal is rather famous for giving birth to the Gurkhas, who are have for centuries served as this elite, unique fighting force within the British Army, and are often tasked with sensitive missions because they are renowned for brutality, reliability, and getting the job done by any means necessary. I might add that the Gurkha the Gurkha Trust, or the Gurkha Welfare Trust, is a sponsor of Hami Nepal, and this is a organization which provides financial assistance to Gurkha veterans, their widows, and families, and it's financed by the British Foreign Office and Ministry of Defence. Now, again, it's not a particularly leap of imagination to suggest that, well, Nepal now could represent some kind of military threat, no matter how negligible, to China, which could tie up Beijing in skirmishes over borders, and all sorts of other matters. Again, a similar dynamic played out in Georgia following the 2003 Rose Revolution, where once the US had installed their puppet Mikhail Saakashvili in Tbilisi, Georgia became a very anti-Russian actor. It was a jumping-off point for Chechen resistance fighters, and in 2008, it effectively started a war with Russia, which it lost very badly, and its US trained, armed, uniformed, and even fed military was routed in a matter of days in a Russian lightning strike. But I think that we've reached the point that even the mildest irritation, it does serve US interests, and it furthers the wider aforementioned quote unquote Indo-Pacific strategy of the US.
Kit, would you like us to display those documents that were leaked?
Yes, please. Yeah, sure.
Okay, we can go ahead and do that.
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at IRI Nepal sweep up proposal, which is this is one of the leak files, and I think it's quite revealing. It talks about the necessity of strengthening youth political and civic participation as champions for democratic change, to building momentum for youth activism, putting pressure on the government, cultivating networks of youth activists and political leaders with skills, resources, and platforms to build connections, so they can communicate their grievances publicly, and training them to advocate concerns on political turmoil, government corruption, policy making, which is, exactly the causes of the recent unrest in Nepal. Again, coincidence or not, it seems to fit very neatly into what the US has been trying to do in Nepal for a very long time.
Quick question.
Sorry, go ahead.
Can people see my screen right now? No? Okay. Something's going on. Let me try again. One second. It says my share is paused for some reason. Huh.
Okay.
I apologize. Let me keep going, Kit. I'll fix it.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's no, it's no problem. But it's like the IRI, the International Republican Institute, they undertook to solicit applications to their Emerging Leaders Academy from young participants in a range of different sectors, including political parties, civil society, and the media, and ensure that these people can hold their leaders to account. Indeed, that it was expected that these alumni of US training programs would go on to become leaders or prominent figures within local political parties, and influence "quote unquote" national decision making, and training them to protest and use social media and other web-based tools, "quote unquote," was a core part of the curriculum. Again, I think that we've seen this play out in fairly graphic detail, not only in Nepal but also in other key hotspots of geopolitical interest in the region, like Indonesia, where we've recently seen protests there, where again there are wide-ranging Western-funded operations to train youth activists and use social media and other platforms for organizing and similar applications. So I mean the training provided to emerging leaders included public speaking, how to hone strategic messaging, mobilize resources, engage in advocacy campaigns, and prepare them for "quote unquote" effective governance. Like, I mean, this is all very on the nose in terms of what they're trying to achieve there and why. As I say, this comes against the backdrop of there are pretty much weekly conferences by the US Congress and reports published by the State Department on the need to contain China, on the need to hinder its seemingly inexorable rise to global hegemon. All of these different programs feed into one another, and they have the same objective, which is trying to maintain US dominance in a region of the world where Washington's influence and economic and political clout has been inexorably waning for a very, very long time. Again, I mean, this is hardly secret. It's there in black and white. It must be stressed that this is not restricted to the Asia-Pacific region. This is happening all over the world. We've seen in Georgia multiple in the past few months. We've seen multiple color revolution attempts in order to get rid of their government for not towing a Western line in all matters all the time. We have there is muttering of attempted insurrection in Hungary, which is considered a bit of a wrecker in terms of the EU's deranged plan to keep the Ukraine proxy war grinding on. This is an ongoing story that's occurring all over the world. And it certainly, even if the media doesn't admit it anymore, and indeed goes to great lengths to deny it, it never ever went anywhere. And there is a vast infrastructure internationally dedicated to creating shadow political structures who can be what's the word? Who can be stirred to foment unrest if target governments step out of line at all. As bleak as this is, it does seem we've reached the point that open US sponsorship of these initiatives is a kiss of death to recipient organizations. Now, there was a 1991 Washington Post piece by the veteran hack David Ignatius, where he talks about the era of overt operations is now upon us, and all of the work that was previously done by the CIA, funding political parties, funding opposition media, funding trade unions, is now done by NED out in the open, and therefore the flat potential, quote unquote, is zero. I think we've kind of come out the other end of that, and we've reached the point where open US sponsorship of opposition groups abroad is for a lot of people, a sign that they have malign intentions and they are being used for malicious purposes by foreign forces. It's no longer the case that the US can say, overthrow the government of Yugoslavia and then boast about it openly. Those days are long behind us. NED has removed its grant database from the web. It used to be a very detailed record of what money was being spent where and on what, and you could see the specific groups that were in receipt of funding for anti-government activities. That got deleted last summer without much fanfare. So it's like the NED, which was meant to be the CIA, but out in the open, has now gone into hiding to a large extent, which is quite an interesting development. On the one hand, the fact that this is being hidden from us is disturbing, and it potentially makes NED more dangerous. At the same time, were it not for the crusading work of independent journalists and researchers in exposing this stuff, they wouldn't have been forced underground. So I think that speaks to a certain weakness of the NED and other kind of pretty much undeniable intelligence cutouts in trying to influence world affairs. They still maintain power, and they're still dangerous, but they have been heavily compromised.
Kit, the work that you are doing on decline and fall and exposing this regime change method that imperialism has adopted is so important. I really want to urge everybody to check out, especially the two-part series that you did on Yugoslavia, which was detailed and very eye-opening. You guys are drawing out just the common elements in each of these cases, whether it be in Ukraine, in Nepal, etc. Back years ago, it was very clear what imperialism was up to when they overthrew the Shah of Iran, and they installed the Marcos regime and the Pinochet regime in Chile. Can you briefly comment on what you see among people today why they're sort of getting this wrong and the implications of that, the fact that they just haven't gotten the lessons of what you're talking about.
Yeah, sure. So it's like I said, is that I think that now that there is a vast infrastructure dedicated to denying Western involvement in unrest abroad, and it's like I say, there was a time when pretty much whenever there was a protest getting serious media coverage anywhere in the world, go onto the NED grant database and those same groups that are quoted in the media are there listed, receiving money. But at the same time, there has been an enormous effort to propagandize people in what I would call the myth of non-violent political action, because there have been films. If we go back to, I mentioned the coup in 2000 in Yugoslavia that got rid of Slobodan Milosevic. Not only were there multiple mainstream media reports on how the US did this and why, and all of offering very detailed accounts of all of the efforts involved in taking him down. There was also a documentary made, and I think it's called "Bringing Down a Dictator," and it's narrated by Charlie Sheen. And it's led a lot of people to believe that governments can be legitimately felled by a few 100,000 or say 1 million people congregating in a public place. That's not reality, but a large number of people have been fed this very steady diet of, well, this is legitimate grievances, this government's corrupt, this government is in bed with the wrong people, and that the majority of population support this. So, I mean, cutting through that's very, very difficult, because I mean, I even mentioned this in my investigation on Nepal, my initial investigation on Nepal, which is, herein lies the rub, which is that that there is no doubt that many Nepalese citizens were disillusioned with their government and sought change, and yet color revolutions invariably exploit grassroots public content to install governments that are considerably worse than those that preceded them. And there is a very interesting piece in Foreign Policy magazine, which is this kind of imperial journal. It was published in March 2013, where it admits that all of the color revolutions at the start of the 2000s, the results were absolutely disastrous. They resulted in the election of leaders and governments who were very authoritarian. Serious change didn't arrive. People's livelihoods got worse. People's living conditions got worse. They were, from every conceivable angle, apart from, say, the profits of wealthy Western oligarchs, complete disaster. But that myth of people power is a very potent one, because I think it's like quite a nice thing to believe. Like all of these people from different backgrounds get together around a shared objective, and then peacefully overthrow their despotic leaders. It's it's something that is like I say, it's a kind of a pleasing fiction, that all of this stuff is grassroots and spontaneous. But as I say, I do think that mask is starting to disintegrate, to a large extent. And if, say, the NED openly published on its website what it was doing in Nepal, there would have been a lot less doubt about who and what was actually behind what went down. But we are now deprived of that, because as I say, NED is overly exposed at this point. But I mean, thank you for your very kind comments about decline and fall. I think that one of the reasons that we have a small but growing and dedicated fan base is that we cut through all of this propaganda. and offer people inconvenient truths and perspectives which are denied them and concealed from them in the mainstream. If you look at polls, never before has distrust of the mainstream media been higher. Never before has distrust of established institutions, particularly Western governments and politicians, been so high. And I don't think that's reversible. I don't think you can put the toothpaste back in the tube, but the only issue is that due to a variety of factors, including algorithmic suppression and the smears of counter disinformation, quote unquote, experts, people are still kind of shut off from those alternative perspectives. But it is possible to break through, and I've been very heartened by some of the feedback we've received from people who have said, well, we've had our eyes opened by your investigations and reporting. So, I mean, I think the audience is there. Even if the answers, say, aren't automatically or easily accessible to them.
I think a real important change that took place was after the Church Committee in the 1970s exposed the CIA. Back in those days, I was a student at Berkeley, and we were out in the streets fighting with the National Guard because
Mm.
of the coup, the coup against Iran, the coup in Chile, et cetera. And it was very clear. And if you today look at the quote unquote opposition, for example, the No Kings demonstration yesterday in Oakland, there's an undercurrent, it's not open, of support for these activities. People had signs that said, restore the cuts in USAID. Can you comment briefly on the USAID's role in these color revolutions that you're talking about, and why are people supporting this?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think that USAID is, I mean that is an entire can of worms. But I think that like the very use of the term aid in its name is like sufficiently misleading in terms of its like actual like activities, because you can point to the fact that USA does do some good things. I mean, it's like, the law of averages. Like, I mean, Hitler was, anti-vivisection, opposed to smoking, and really like dogs, and it's like there is a certain component of what USA does, which was concerned with actually providing assistance to people in need. But I mean, I think that in my neck of the woods, if you look at Bosnia and Herzegovina, that was a country which, according to the terms of the Dayton Agreement, which ended the horrific civil war in Bosnia in November 1995, or coming up to its 30th anniversary in a few weeks' time. Under the terms of that agreement, very specifically, NGOs funded by Soros and NED and USAID were moved in to Bosnia to fulfill the most basic functions of government. And you have a situation now where NGOs are active in every conceivable sphere of public and even private life. They build homes and they rebuild homes and build new ones. They provide counseling to rape survivors and traumatized veterans. They oversee school curriculums. They distribute food. They run community bridge building initiatives, and promote religious tolerance and human rights. And it's like, this is what the government did before the war, and it's now been outsourced to all of these proxies, and there is an enormous amount of corruption within that. It creates an enormous amount of problems in terms of people not knowing where to go to get assistance. Organizations themselves don't know like what to provide. But it's like, yeah, there is USAID did do some good things, but it was under the cover of aid that it conducted so much of its insidious activities. And I've written a lot about the US about USAID's Office of Transition initiatives, which was openly created in order to assist the quote unquote transition of countries to democracy, which is to say, facilitate regime change. And there are a number of examples that that I've written about, and I mean, you could just find this in the public record of where OTI, in the wake of a government falling, usually as a result of NED, Western-sponsored anti-government activists, they have gone in and created a government from the ground up, and they run its communications, they run its administration, they write the speeches of leaders, and and all this other all this other stuff, and on. It's now, you can't find it on the internet anymore, but OTI's website explicitly stated that we exploit policy windows of opportunity for the US. I mean, it was openly spelled out, what it was doing and why, and there are a number of examples, including in recent years, of OTI, such as in Sudan, in the wake of the 2019 coup there, that they created this deeply corrupt, deeply this savage interim administration, which jailed dissenters, banned opposition media, and was corrupt to an absolutely obscene degree. And yet then USA Chief Samantha Power, this kind of longtime war hawk, is cheering Sudan's transition to democracy. And it's like, I think that there is an element of we've kind of reached this emperor's new clothes style dynamic, where it's like, well, reality is whatever officials say, even if it's completely untrue. And I mean, to give you a more recent example, Moldova, that is a country which is, again, heavily colonized. I mean, it's this tiny scrap of land with a population of about 3 million. And, I have reported on leaked recordings of Moldovan government officials and business people talking about how the country is a EU-US colony. And, every Moldovan government ministry has dozens, if not hundreds, of Western advisors, telling them what to do and not do, and dictating their policy for them and stuff. And that they are entirely dependent on this infrastructure to exist. If it was removed tomorrow, they would collapse.
Okay, so let's take a short break for announcements, and we're going to have questions and comments from participants. For participants, if you want to ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand by clicking on the reactions button, raise hand at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please keep your questions short. We're already getting quite a few questions coming up. And ask one question at a time to allow everyone to participate. Keep in mind that this is a comradely forum for political discussion. Please show respect to the other participants, the speaker, and the moderator of today's session. Next week, we have on Sunday Morning Marxist Forum, our speaker will be California Humboldt County activist Rainer Shea, who will be speaking on how 21st century workers' struggle for socialism has changed. This is going to be a very thought-provoking session. You can check our website for future programs at icssmarks.org, and also sign up for notifications where you'll receive the announcements and a link to join the sessions. Before we go to the Q&A for people who have your hands raised, I'd like to get a couple of questions in that were raised on the chat during Kit's talk. So Sharon, if you would please just take a couple of them and ask them to Kit.
Thank
We
you.
can start with those.
Thank you, Kit. So one person who's already asked a question has their hand up, so I'll let him ask his question. But something else that's in the chat a couple of times is, do you have any thoughts on Brian Bertolick's work on Nepal? And for example, who is behind regime change in Nepal and how to follow the money? Apparently that's on YouTube right now.
Yeah, sure. So I know Brian personally. I consider him a friend. I have enormous amount of respect for him. I think that his analysis on this has been fantastic. I can find nothing to fault in what he said. I think that he's actually, much to his credit, he put his neck on the line and stated up front when the Nepalese government fell, this is the US's work. And there was a lot of people, as I mentioned, there were prominent geopolitical analysts who I have respect for, and I would say should know better, who were very quick to pour cold water on this prospect. But he stayed on it. He's kept digging. He's shown the individual organizational institutional links between the people who are forming the interim government and Western organizations and entities and such. So yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. Follow the money. It's that classic line from All the President's Men, and it still stands up today. And as I say, the NED removing its grant database was a deliberate effort to prevent people doing this. And if powerful people don't want you to do something, it shows that that's what you should be doing.
Okay, so
And
let's.
there's one
Go
other
ahead.
one, Alan. Any thoughts on what's going on in Madagascar?
Madagascar, it's not something I've been following particularly. I know that there has been unrest there. Again, I think that what you've got to bear in mind is that what's happening there falls against a wider story of the West, particularly the French and the US and the British, being on the run in Africa. And I think that Madagascar, because it's an island off Africa, is actually probably a very good training ground for potential quote unquote revolutionaries to be helicoptered into other parts of the continent. I mean, you got to bear in mind, that like Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Senegal, other countries, they've booted out to mass public praise foreign forces and influence from their territory, and this is growing across the continent. Madagascar, it already, not to the same extent as perhaps other overseas territories, but it remains to an extent a British colony with a heavy British influence, and so again, it would be a very useful beachhead for creating problems, particularly in the Horn of Africa, where again you have in Ethiopia and Somalia, you have growing independence movements. Even if the objective is purely just creating chaos, this is something that the West is willing to do just for the sake of it. That would be my take, and I think that bear in mind as well that the Madagascar's geographical adjacency to parts of Africa that were firmly in the imperial camp until relatively recently, like Mozambique's only become independent within the past kind of half century. And there were efforts throughout the 1980s by the then apartheid South Africa to cripple independence movements in places like Angola and Zambia and Mozambique. The interest in Africa has not gone anywhere, particularly given that Chinese and Russian influence is growing there by the day.
Okay, so first I'd like to call on Anne. So Anne Garrison, if you would please unmute and ask your question. Anne?
Yeah,
there you go.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I'd like, oh, sorry if I missed something. I'm curious about what you said about Sudan, what you meant there. The U.S. has issued a statement that the RSF is guilty of genocide in Sudan, but I also said that the other side is guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. So what were you saying about that? I'm also curious, what were you saying when you said just now that there were independence movements in Ethiopia and Somalia? And then lastly, a comment with yesterday's No Kings rally. there was a color revolution theme that they tried to impose by asking people to wear yellow in solidarity with protests in Hong Kong, which happened, I think, years ago, and with Eastern Ukraine, with a yellow ribbon movement in Eastern Ukraine. So go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we've also seen the yellow ribbons about employed in respect of the Israeli hostages who've finally been released. But yeah, I mean, you know, it should never be forgotten that these people are nothing if not unimaginative. You know, the same strategies keep getting used over and over and over again. And this is a point I actually made, I think, on the most recent Decline and Fall, is when you create this kind of heaving, groaning infrastructure of people who are trained to do a particular thing, which is to say, overthrow governments using civil society entities and actors, they'll keep doing it because it's all they know how to do, even if it's not effective, even if it's counterproductive. They'll just keep going. And you know, when they look at the drawing board, well, drawing on past successes is all they can cling on to. And it's like, I mean, you know, I to bring this full circle back to Nepal, the leaked files which I mentioned about NED youth training, they make a lot of reference to these Nepalese protests in 2020, which were in response to the government's supposedly lackluster COVID response, which were called Enough is Enough. And these were protests that got a lot of Western media coverage. The protesters were holding signs written in English, indicating that their audience wasn't, you know, local politicians or the population. But they talk over and over again about recreating this success, right? And it's just like, yeah, no, we need to do this again. We need to do this again. You know, they have no fresh ideas whatsoever. And I think that they, you know, trying to recreate or relive past glories is all they've got left at this point.
Okay, next I wanted to ask Elazar to unmute yourself and ask your question, followed by Raj. So Elazar, you go ahead and unmute. We're waiting for you.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
I have a simple question. First of all, I appreciate the talk and the wide range beyond Nepal that you covered. But in the left, there's great confusion about what I call the U.S. NATO imperialist proxy, Ukraine proxy war against Russia. There's a whole section of the left that condemns Russia and calls it an unprovoked invasion. And they leave out the 2014 overthrow of the Yanukovych government, the Maidan massacre, which definitely the U.S. was involved in and worked with neo-Nazis. I've got pictures of Biden shaking hands with Ola Tahanibuk, head of a neo-Nazi murder group. And so I would like your opinion on that. I give critical support to non-imperialist but capitalist Russia's invasion of Ukraine. End of question.
Okay, sure. Okay, sure. So, I mean, I think that I think one of the issues with the proxy war in Ukraine that a lot of people miss is this was presaged by design by a very you know, a dedicated propaganda campaign to demonize Russia as you know, just these these backwards, dangerous savages who had it out for the West and were meddling in the West's affairs, you know, rigging elections and, you know, hacking and all this other rubbish. This was a dedicated British propaganda strategy, and it was explicitly intended to serve as a precursor for war. There is an organization I've written about a lot called the Institute for Statecraft. It's run by MI6 and NATO veterans. And on their own website in July 2014, they published an essay saying we need to diplomatically isolate Russia, we need to sanction Russia, we need to demonize demonize them via propaganda, and this will lead to armed conflict of the old-fashioned sort that Britain and the West can win. Okay, and so like cutting through this layer upon layer of demonization, which has been built up over so many years, is very difficult. And as someone who studied Russian politics under Richard Sackler, who's regarded as the West's foremost expert on the subject, when Maidan happened, and then you have Crimea and all these other events, I remember having these very heated discussions with people who had no idea what they were talking about, but were very, very, very certain that they knew what was going on. And they saw Putin as this kind of Hitler 2.0 figure. Cutting through that matrix of negative propaganda about Russia and Russians is very difficult. And although this said, even among people I know personally who were very pro-Ukraine and were very anti-Russian, those sentiments remain, but they're kind of shifting to the view that this was always unwinnable, and that actually maybe the West did have something to do with provoking this. That maybe we should just get out of this while we still can, because of the risk of escalation and the risk of Ukraine being reduced to Kiev and not very much else. So again, I call it bloody-minded optimism. But I do see some encouraging signs in that regard. But you've also got to bear in mind that, the mainstream left has also been terrible on Syria. It's been largely terrible on Israel and Palestine for the most part for a very long time. It's only select pockets of the left who've been consistently pro-Palestinian, since Israel's creation. So these things do take time, but I do think that sense will prevail, and I think particularly sense will prevail when Russia pretty much inevitably wins on the battlefield, and the West is left to count its losses, as it were, which is pretty major. All of the money and the energy and the material support pumped into this proxy war, which is always going to end in Russian victory. Conducting any remotely serious analysis of how wrong people got it on this, I think it will lead to some degree of enlightenment amongst the converted, although maybe I'm being overly optimistic.
Okay, next is Raj, followed by Janet. So Raj, please go ahead.
Thank you, Kit, for very informative presentation.
My pleasure.
My question to you is, what do you find, because Nepal has a very old relationship with India, culturally, in every which way. There's a lot of connection between Nepalese people and Indian. And Nepal today was ruled by a communist party in the lead. I think it was a coalition government which was overthrown by this, with which I think United India was uncomfortable, but they worked with them. So what did you find, investigation, the role of India in all this? And is it only about China, the United States? Because it's overthrown. I agree with you. Bangladesh and in Pakistan, they didn't have the color revolution, but they overthrew Imran Khan
Yes.
So therefore, they're of course interfered in Pakistan all the time through the military. Now here, how do you see this impacting India and India-China relationship, if you have looked into that? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So, like I say, I think I very much see this as this occurring as inextricably linked to India's warming relations with China, and the fact. We see this now where the US still is desperately trying to claim that India has stopped importing Russian energy, and Indian officials say this is just simply untrue. And it's like India has, for all of the faults of Modi's government, I'm certainly not a supporter or advocate of his rule, but they have attempted to carve out their own path in international affairs, and this simply won't do, which is why, again, like I said at the start, having this state wedged between, and like I say, the leaks make repeated reference to the fact that Nepal is quote unquote sandwiched between these great powers, and that's why we need to ensure that it follows a US line in all matters. So yeah, this is very much about trying to undermine India. India and Nepal have a long, very complicated relationship. I can't claim to be an expert in that. They've not always been on good terms, and I do think that India does, because of geography, does maintain some degree of control over Nepal's economy, etc. But again, the imposition of this new government could change that, and they could become more dependent on the US economically, militarily, and politically, and become this source of immense irritation to both of its much larger neighbors. One can only hope that India and China see eye to eye and see sense on this, and band together to fight back against whatever's coming.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, next is Janet, followed by Mike H. So Janet, please go ahead.
Okay,
Unmute.
thank you, Alan. And thank you, Kit, for being here with us today and
My
for
pleasure.
all your great work. Going back to Nepal, would you talk about what its military looks like, the size, how it is funded and governed, and also, are there any non-state actor armed resistance groups in Nepal? And if so, would you talk about them?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the Nepali armed forces, like I mentioned, they're a very powerful force within Nepalese society, but they're also a very popular one as well. And one of the reasons that it seems that Nepalese citizens have been welcoming of what is effectively a violent coup is because the military signed off on it. And on September 9th, after Sharma Oli fled his residence, the military met with protest leaders. They had a friendly, fruitful meeting, and they said, how can we help? What do you see as the future of Nepal, etc. So yeah, like but as I say, the fact of the matter is they have ultimately signed off on what is an illegitimate violent coup, and also they have tried to include monarchist elements in talks with Gen Z leaders since the very start of this. And it must be stressed as well that there are monarchist-linked figures who support Hami Nepal, which, as I say, is at the forefront of this. There are armed groups in Nepal. For the most part, they have historically supported one of Nepal's established political parties. There was a very interesting I believe it was a New York Times report in kind of mid-September, where it stated that Nepalese of all extractions moved to reject a system they themselves had fought for decades to achieve, and they lack any clear sense of what comes next. That creates a massive vacuum, which a lot of different forces could exploit, including established political parties who do often have paramilitary wings and have actually, in a bitter irony, historically deployed youth activists as foot soldiers when the government of the day does something they don't like. So again, it's a bit of a powder keg situation, which I think that the military, for the time being, is kind of keeping the peace. It might not be doing so particularly peacefully, but yeah, they are a very powerful, potent force within society. And I think that sadly, if it comes down to it, and they military chiefs say, well, we can't get any, we can't make any traction on discussions around the shape of the future of Nepal, maybe we should just take power. That could happen. There was a similar dynamic in Myanmar, that known as Burma when it was part of the British Empire, where the military was doing its utmost for many years to try and keep the elected administration in power. When it was clear that the elected government had no legitimacy, they took over, and suddenly they become the bad guys, and they're the source of all of the violence and unrest in Myanmar, when actually they're just desperately trying to maintain some sense of order.
Okay, next is Mike H, followed by Mark Wilson. So Mike, if you would please unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, my question is about the Straw Hat Pirates Jolly Rancher flag that keeps showing up in about 20 different countries, starting with Indonesia, Nepal, Madagascar, and many of the countries that the Russian Africa Corps is in, like Niger, Mali. It seems to be the common element, and I'm curious, it comes from the Japanese manga series One Piece. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
I'm not familiar with that. I think that what I find more concerning is the profusion of the clenched fist logo, which was used by Otpor. Like you see a lot of this. If you search OTPOR fist on Google Images, you can. I mean, this is a symbol which is used by a lot of protest groups, including in Nepal. Again, as I said in response to a previous question, I strongly suspect that the US Imperial Brain Trust is just out of ideas at this point, and they're like leaping on what popular memes, etc., or like what they think would mean being down with the kids, as it were. I wouldn't necessarily attach greater significance to it than that.
Okay, Mark Wilson, if you would please ask your question, followed by Richard Wright. Mark, please go ahead.
Yeah, I want to thank the library for all their great work, and I want to thank Kit for joining us. I'm interested in your take on what I call total war or fifth generation warfare. If you could give us a little update on how that's been wielded against you personally. I'm wondering about yesterday's Democratic Party organized protests in the United States, and I wonder if color revolution tactics aren't being used against us.
Well, okay, so that's an interesting question. I mean, number one, I would say that in respect to my own experiences, I think that we've reached the point of excuse me, I think that we've reached the point of brazen tyranny in the Western world, where governments know that they can pretty much do whatever they want, and irrespective of the backlash, like there's not really going to be any consequences for it. So, I mean, from my own perspective, I was detained under counter-terrorism legislation upon my return to my home city of London in May 2023. And interrogated for many hours, digitally strip searched. I had to hand over the PIN codes to my digital devices. This caused quite a scandal, and I was shocked that, I was interviewed by The Hill, of all places. I mean, this was a story that traveled around the world, and I had emails flooding in from every continent expressing solidarity and sympathy with me, which meant an enormous amount, and I thought that the backlash from this might serve as some deterrent to British authorities doing the same. They've just kept doing it ever since. My friends of mine, George Galloway and his wife, Steve Sweeney, Asa Winstanley, Craig Murray, Richie Medhurst, all of these independent journalists, David Miller, I might add as well, another friend of mine, dissident academics, journalists, just pundits have been on the receiving end. And it is a form of warfare, and it does have a chilling effect, I think, for a lot of people. And it serves as a deterrent for, pour l'encourager les autres. Like it serves as a deterrent for other people doing this. Now, I mean, on the subject of color revolution tactics being employed in the US, I've actually again written about this. There was a really quite extraordinary, I believe it was Time magazine article in February 2021, where they published this very lengthy investigation into how Democratic Party activists, unions, anti-Trump Republicans, major US corporations, particularly big tech, they banded together to quote unquote fortify the 2020 presidential election and ensure the vote's proper outcome, which is to say Biden's victory. And the article also coincidentally noted that on January 6th, pro-Biden activists and left-wingers had been explicitly warned by the people who led this effort to fortify the election to avoid the Capitol, to preserve safety and ensure they couldn't be blamed for any mayhem. Which so this timepiece like kind of outlines what we would consider a color revolution in terms of the tactics employed, in terms of the strategies, it's clear that they seem to have some kind of foreknowledge of the fact that of what was coming on January 6th. So I mean, you might call that a color revolution, if you wish. I think that what's very clear is techniques of repression, of subversion, of destabilization, which are honed abroad, they do come back home. And, I mean, from my own experience, the British have some form in terms of dragging innocent people in for questioning under vague, baseless allegations of them being extremists. When they ran the empire, they did so in Northern Ireland for decades. They had a policy called internment without trial, where they would literally go to the houses of Catholics residing in Northern Ireland and say, come with us. And these people would spend, in some cases, years in prison without charge, without trial, being tortured all along the way because they were suspected, often for no good reason, of working with Irish Republicans. So, it is no surprise that this stuff comes back home as their ability to do this overseas recedes.
Okay, next is Richard, followed by James, and then Sharon. Then we're going to wrap up. So go ahead, Richard Wright. Please go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation, Kit.
My pleasure.
I have actually sort of three questions.
Well, let's try to keep it to one.
Well, they're quick. They're sort of quick.
Okay.
I was wondering, one, if you could comment on the Bagram, Trump trying to buy the Bagram air base. Two, the other thing, this is more of a comment. It seems to me that a lot of the color revolutions that take place seem to be focused on the executive branch and not so much on the legislative or the popular. But the real question I thought is in your presentation, you mentioned that you had gotten documents from the Institute of Republican Initiatives. I think that's what it's called.
The International Republican Institute. Yeah.
Okay. I guess okay. In any case, I don't know how familiar the people here are with the NED. It started off as basically four chambers. I'll call them chambers. And I was wondering if maybe you could go into a little bit of explaining to these people, and if any of your documents came from like the Chamber of Commerce side of things, or the Democratic side of things. And the other thing is I've heard that they're starting to mix private money into the NED. So if you would, thank you.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, it's wrong to view the blob, as it were, as a monolith. Or there's an enormous amount of overlap in this stuff where it's like to give you an example, the National Democratic Institute, which is the IRI's counterpart wing of NED, it gets up to much the same activities overseas, and that there's often kind of jurisdictional arguments between the two over like whose responsibility is what. But I think that, I mean, you know, ultimately say, to use an example from a prior investigation of mine into Indonesia, these wings of NED are taking usually direct orders from the local US embassy, who in turn is probably getting orders from the White House, the State Department, the US Chamber of Commerce, maybe the Federal Reserve. Like, you know, every branch of government is giving them direction. So in Indonesia, as I say, I reported on this for Mint Press in 2024. There was this like amazing excerpt in a leaked document where leaked NED document where representatives of of Indonesia's local NED chapter, they met with the US ambassador, who said, well, you know, we in DC are not happy about this new law that Indonesian government has passed, which means that firms need, private companies need to prioritize creating jobs rather than profit seeking. And the US ambassador said, we are unhappy about the implications for the investment environment in Indonesia. Now, subsequent to this, the NED funded a wide variety of organizations and groups and individuals to protest this new legislation. And, you know, they burnt stuff down. They were not peaceful in any way. So you kind of see how all of these disparate, seemingly disparate and separate entities all intersect. It's like, I mean, Michael Parenti has a great line about, you know, the empire feeding off the republic. It's like decisions and declarations made in DC, one way or another, they filter out to all of these disparate, call them satraps of empire overseas, and then locals end up doing their bidding.
Alan, you're muted.
Sorry. Next is James, followed by Sharon. James, please go ahead.
First, I'd like to thank you. I regularly read you, Kit, so that's enjoy your articles.
Thank you. Thank you.
And and I missed much of your talk today. I'm sorry, but I have with grandchildren. But
That's right.
the Alan Weinstein wrote, you know, a lot of what we do today is done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA. So one question I have is, do you have a sense of how much of Color Revolution is actually run through NGOs like USAID or NED and that kind of thing, so where money can be funneled, and how much is still done in a covert manner, you know, to make all this work. And then just one other quick thing. Earlier, you were asked about Sudan and Ethiopia, but you kind of got off a little track. And if you could go back and just say something about that too. But mostly, I'm interested in the issue of how much is covert and how much is still done covertly by the CIA.
Okay, sure. So, I mean, I think that, I mean, in respect of your first question, I think the NED, they always provide like the public face of a quote unquote color revolution. So they're the one, you know, they train the youth activists who are presented in the media as leading this. But always there is something going on in the background that's usually done by the CIA. So you know, for example, I mean, I mentioned the overthrow of Milosevic in October 5th, 2000. So that's, you know, we're now 2 weeks past the 25th anniversary of that. There is a very revealing Washington Post kind of post-mortem on his overthrow that was published in December of that year. And it talks about how, you know, USAID, NED were all involved in this, and, you know, to the extent of buying anti-Milosevic activists thousands of cans of spray paint to encourage them to daub Belgrade with anti-Milosevic graffiti. The Washington Post noted that the CIA was simultaneously wreaking havoc locally, but nobody really knew what it was up to. So I do think that it's kind of like a hand in glove aspect to this, that they operate together. One is the public face, one is the covert face, and we may never know precisely what the CIA is up to, behind the scenes. So there's that aspect to it. I mean, in respect of Sudan and Ethiopia, I mean, my only point would be that the 2019 coup in Sudan was a very obvious example of how US aid moved in and exploited a quote unquote window of opportunity to install a puppet government that had no legitimacy, which was overthrown by actual people power after 2 years of being in office and being a complete disgrace. In Ethiopia, you had the election, I believe it was in 2020, I might be wrong, it was like the very first Ethiopia's like first truly democratic government in a very long time. And they're certainly not without fault, but they have done a lot of things to improve living standards locally, and there has been enormous attempts to undermine them via covert means, with the funding of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which is this kind of extremist faction that leaves a trail of beheaded children and raped women behind them wherever they go. But on the other hand, on the flip side of this as well, is that US aid was basically kicked out of Ethiopia after this government was elected, and Samantha Power, again, then USA chief, said there's no problem in Ethiopia that US boots on the ground can't solve. So I think this actually kind of ties in with your question, and my wider answer is that like these things operate in tandem, even if it's not particularly obvious. It's like you have the civil society, the military, and the intelligence operations, all factoring into one another. It doesn't always work, but
Okay, next is Sharon. Kid, I hope you don't mind. We're running a few minutes over. If you
that's
don't mind
fine.
staying,
Absolutely fine.
got a couple of more questions here. Sharon, followed by Judith, and I think we're going to wrap it up. So
Okay.
go ahead, Sharon.
Thank you, Kit. I want to thank the person who talked about the yellow color yesterday. I was in Berkeley, near University of California, at a demonstration, and there were a lot of people wearing yellow, and I didn't understand why. But some people had a banana symbol, and they said something about, is the U.S. becoming a banana republic or something like that, which is absolutely stupid. But in any case, I believe that it's very important for the left to look at how we talk about U.S. imperialism and adventures abroad and financing coups and all the rest that you've described, how we talk about that to the American people, American working class, because to some extent, historically speaking, what Lenin called the labor aristocracy here has benefited in some ways from U.S. Imperialist adventures, but that's less and less true now, if it is at all. And we need to be able to talk to people. It's not a moral question. It's how imperialism hurts people around the world, including us. And the current situation in Washington is a good example. The shutdown of the government over the issue of the huge cutbacks in support for health care, which is going to affect millions of people. And why are they even doing that? Why are the Republicans and the Trump regime even doing that? Well, the US debt is huge and getting bigger, and that's because of the enormous, disgusting, enormous expenditure on weaponry and the military industrial complex, which benefits from all this intervention all over the place. And the proxy war in Ukraine is a good example, and aid to Israel is a good example. And my
If you
experience.
could just go ahead and, because we're running
Yeah,
over,
so
go ahead, Raph.
my point only is that we on the left need to think about how we talk about US imperialism to ordinary people so that it's not just a moral question.
Yeah. Okay. Judith, if you want to go ahead and ask your question, you're unmuted. I'm sure we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. All right. Kit, thank you. That was a wonderful presentation.
My pleasure.
And okay, so I don't know how about the economy of Nepal. What kind of industries do they have? And what kind of relationships does the academic and scientific community of Nepal have with China? And also the color revolutions in Ukraine, uh, uh, they there was an ideology of fascism that they used to turn the population against Russia. Is there any kind of background in Nepal of fascism or a type of fascism in their past that they can use against China? Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Well, yeah, like I said, like Nepal for a very long time was run by an absolute monarchy, and in shockingly, as with pretty much every absolute monarchy in the world, such as the Gulf states, this was created by the British for the purposes of domestic repression. So it's like, this monarchy lasted from the late 1700s till 2008. Although after 1990, its power started waning significantly. This is a revanchist, repressive force which could be stirred by anti-Russian sentiment. And we mentioned the Hong Kong protests. We saw a lot of the the NED-sponsored Color Revolution protesters waving British and American flags, begging for the return of British rule to Hong Kong. It's very easy to stoke up false historical memories, historical grievances, amongst nationalists. It's something that the British and the Americans have been doing for a very long time, at the risk of, a shameless plug of my own work. It's something that I've focused on a lot. A recent investigation of mine looks into how the British and then the Americans, along with the British, sponsored nationalists in the Baltic states, in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, specifically for the purposes of undermining communist rule. So the prospect is there, and certainly that there are people who are very, very keen for the return of the absolute monarchy and have links to armed groups and the military. So this is something that is very dangerous. It is as I say, it is a veritable powder keg. I think China seems to be playing it very safe for the time being. They have recognized the new government. They say they want to work with the new government. But equally, I think that the long-standing position of Beijing of non-interference in other countries' affairs, we've reached the point that this is untenable now, because their adversaries, and their openly avowed stated adversaries, do not play the same game. They are very much up for interference in other countries' affairs. They see it as their key performance indicator, meddling in other countries, and dictating how other countries govern themselves. So we shall see. Like I say, this is a story that's rather dropped off the radar, but it's worth keeping an eye on, because the present geopolitical situation, I think, is a pressure cooker waiting to burst on many fronts. So yeah, we shall see.
Okay.
Alan, before we close, Kit, could you put your contact information in the chat? Several people have asked for it.
Oh yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Okay, it's time for us to wrap up. I want to thank Kit for an excellent presentation, excellent session. The
My
questions,
absolute pleasure.
the questions were very good, and the answers were great. Kit, I think you deserve multiple Pulitzer Prizes, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. In the meantime, I would urge everybody to go to Decline and Fall, go to his Substack, sign up. This is the best journalism that's going on the internet today, and don't miss out on it and support it. Also, want to encourage everybody to come back next week to hear a discussion on 21st century struggle for socialism, workers' struggle for socialism with Rainer Shea, and to go to our website at icssmarks.org, sign up for notifications, make a donation to support our work. And with that, we're going to stop the recording.
Well,
And
if I
yeah,
may,
please go
if I
ahead.
may interject, thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure. It's very sweet of you to say that I deserve multiple Pulitzer Prizes, but in the spirit of Groucho Marx, I wouldn't want to be part of a club that would have me as a member. So, no, like, take care, guys. Thank you so much. Have a lovely day.
Thank you,
Bye bye.
Kit. Okay, bye bye.